Hello, my name is Antoine Garth, and I am the creator of Afro Yoga Sacramento. And today I just want to talk a little bit about my interest in yoga and how much I noticed in my life with yoga that how few black people, or African Americans rather, how few African Americans, actually how few Africans as well, but how few African Americans were involved with yoga. Interestingly enough, in Austin, Texas, where I lived right before here, my main yoga teacher was African American, but generally the community was not particularly involved with yoga. And what I came to understand was that there were some racial cultural misconceptions that at some point I would love to kind of talk about, but also that there were some spiritual misconceptions or spiritual apprehensions or spiritual reservations that then led people to not engage in doing yoga. And that's really what I want to address today. So the title of this seminar is I'm Christian, Can I Do Yoga? And I wanted to talk specifically about what could possibly be construed as conflict, where the conflict might possibly be seen, and whether or not there actually is a conflict. So first of all, I want to talk about a very interesting website and project that I've become interested in called the Mystic Soul Project. And the Mystic Soul Project, its focus is essentially to take the onus or take the scrutiny of what they call colonialized Christianity off of indigenous and ancestral traditions. So this is specifically for people of color who are in the Christian tradition. And to basically kind of reevaluate those traditions. So for excuse me, for instance, one woman was an Asian woman whose mother was Buddhist. She herself had become an evangelical, but her mother was Buddhist, and she was just starting to reevaluate Buddhism without seeing it as something demonic, and something that, if it's not under the mantle of Jesus Christ, then it's from the devil and it's to be shunned. And so that's the first kind of prism or focus that I'd like to look at for just a moment, because recently the Pope said about issues of transgender that it was a form of ideological colonization, or that ideological colonization was to be resisted. And in my opinion, that was a very ironic statement, because ideological colonization, that's the history of Christianity, of the spread of Christianity in the Western world, is essentially the spread of ideological colonization. And it's essentially through this idea of Christian primacy and of having to fully reject 100% anything that is of the original tradition that doesn't fall under the mantle of Christian dogma. Well, shall we say? I don't necessarily mean that word in a bad form, but under Christian dogma. So my point is, if we are to be fully open, we have to be able to look in a neutral manner at other traditions and see whether or not there is something that can be used or not. And in the case of yoga, absolutely it can be used. So first of all, let's talk about what yoga is. And as with now, yoga is an ancient tradition which has ancient scriptures involved. But when I tell you, and I'm going to actually use an ancient language involved with this ancient scripture to talk about it, but when I do, you will maybe start to understand why there is not necessarily an issue. In the main scripture that is used in yogic philosophy and yoga philosophy and higher yogic philosophy, this particular scripture is called Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And in the Yoga Sutras, the definition of yoga in Sanskrit is yoga chitta vritti naroda. Yoga chitta vritti naroda. Yoga is the ceasing of the turning of the mind. That is the definition of yoga as per Patanjali. So as per the text, the go-to ancient text for yoga. So first of all, let's look at that in reflection or in respect to with respect to Christianity. Does that say anything about religion? No. Does that say anything about worshiping God? Not necessarily yet. But really all it says is that yoga is the ceasing of the turning of the mind. Now, to give you another piece of this, and this doesn't necessarily come from Patanjali himself, but it does come from commentary on Patanjali, and the definition of the mind is the subtle form of the body, and the body is the gross form of the mind. So the use of yoga, or the activity of yoga, or the action of yoga, or the involvement in yoga, which is the ceasing of the turning of the mind, can also be done or can be initiated through the physical. So one misconception about yoga is that it is a physical exercise. It is not. Another misconception may be coming from the influences of colonial Christianity, is that it's representing a religious tradition. It does not. However, yoga is an ancient wisdom tradition from India, and it is connected to the Vedas, which are the Hindu scriptures of India. It, however, does not have any specific interest, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. So Chitta Vritti Nirodha means ceasing the turnings of the mind. So yoga is basically about examining your mind. When we're working on our bodies, doing the postures, what are called the postures, the asanas, which is basically what's happening in a yoga class, we're essentially working our bodies through our minds. We're working our minds through our bodies, rather. So within that class, we're working our bodies through our minds, because what's happening is, in the process of doing asana and we're bringing awareness to different aspects of our body where awareness was not before, where awareness was not present before. As a result, we are redistributing our mind into different parts of our body. We're distributing our mind into all of our body. That is essentially an aspect, that's the first initiating process of the ceasing of the turning of the mind. So as a result, there is this process through the activity of asana, through doing asana, which is once again the postures, of clearing the narrative in the body. What's what I call, and that's why people get so bendy. That's basically, the body becomes an object that the mind wills into any position. And so there we have this connection between the mind being the subtle form of the body and the body being the gross form of the mind. So that's two aspects of what we're talking about here in what yoga is and what yoga is trying to do. But I'd like to go a little further into the idea of yoga, and to also to deal with the concept of God and whether or not yoga is in conflict with Christianity, whether or not yoga can be used to work with Christianity. What actually, how is it that yoga is perceived to be spiritual is probably the question. And so that's what I'd like to try to answer right now.